Open the podcast bay door as hell.
Welcome to episode 23 of Welcome to Geektown. I'm your host, Kurt Onstead. I've been a proud geek all my life, being into role-playing games, board games, sci-fi, fantasy, and especially superheroes and comics. And I want to help others join me in those pursuits. But I found that sometimes people can get overwhelmed or feel left out because they don't already have what some consider the requisite knowledge to be considered a fan. And that's where Welcome to Geektown comes in. Here you can ask your questions without feeling like a gatekeeper is calling you out for not yet being fully versed in every aspect of your new interest. Before we begin, please go and take the time to leave a 5-star review over on the iTunes podcast page. It will be really helpful to me in order to have the show reach a wider audience. Thanks. This week's question comes from Keisha G. She's a Star Trek fan and writes, I'm slowly converting my husband, and because he seemed hesitant to watch the dated-looking shows, I started him on Season 1 of Discovery, and we're all caught up and waiting for the next episode of Season 2. He's excited and wants to know more of the story, so I'm thinking of taking him through the series and films in chronological order, meaning following the fictional timeline, not release/production order. In my mind, this means jumping back to Enterprise and continuing with Disco, followed by TOS, TNG, DS9, and finishing with Voyager. But then I've got the films to consider and where they fit in the big picture. A cursory Google search gave me a watch order I really don't like. Do you have any suggestions? And any thoughts on where singular episodes like The Cage fall on the timeline? I'm told that episode takes place prior to the events of Disco. For the curious, I'll include the reading order that she found, so you can compare if you like. So, Keisha, that's a long question, and it has an even longer answer. First off, some acronym explanations for those listening who are unfamiliar. Star Trek has had a number of series over the years, and so shorthand has developed for each of those shows' names. TOS is the original series, or just Star Trek, which ran from 1966 to 1969. That's the one with Kirk, Spock, McCoy, and their crew. And that crew is also in the 70s animated series that ran for 2 seasons. Then, in 1987, Star Trek The Next Generation premiered, which was shortened by fans to TNG, or sometimes Next Gen. Star Trek Deep Space Nine, or DS9, premiered in 1993, while Next Gen was still on the air. Then Star Trek Voyager started in 1995, with its first few seasons running concurrent with DS9's finishing seasons. Star Trek Enterprise premiered the season after Voyager's end in 2001. Voyager and Enterprise don't have acronyms in spoken conversation, but written down, I've seen them shortened to VOY and ENT, respectively. Finally, after a long break with no Star Trek on the small screen, Star Trek Discovery premiered last year on CBS's streaming service. Discovery has been shortened to Disco on the show. The crew members' casual clothes bear that appellation. But in online writing, I usually see it shortened as DIS, or the unfortunate acronym STD. Up until Enterprise, all of the shows aired basically in chronological order. The original and animated series took place in the mid-23rd century, and TNG, DS9, and Voyager took place in the mid to late 24th. However, Enterprise was a prequel show that takes place in the mid-22nd century, just over 100 years before the original series. It shows how Starfleet began, the organization that basically all of the previous crews were a part of, or somehow connected to. Discovery also takes place before TOS does, but is closer to the TOS timeline than it is to Enterprise, starting just 10 years before the first episode of the original series takes place. Keisha also mentions The Cage. The Cage was the original unaired pilot to Star Trek. Spock is the only character from that first pilot that transferred over to the second pilot and the series. However, footage from that episode was later used in a TOS episode titled The Menagerie, and so it is now considered to be part of Star Trek canon. The captain of the Enterprise in The Cage was Christopher Pike, who has shown up in the J.J. Abrams movies and is currently being played by Anson Mount in Season 2 of Discovery. So, if you were to watch things in chronological order from an in-universe point of view, your order would be Enterprise, The Cage, Discovery, TOS, TAS, the first 6 movies, then TNG, DS9, and Voyager. The 4 Next Generation cast movies would fit somewhere between episodes of DS9 and Voyager, with the final movie taking place after Voyager ends, but are so separate that we don't need to get specific on that right now. However, I think trying to watch Star Trek in the in-universe chronological order is a mistake for trying to introduce the show, especially with Enterprise. It calls back so much to the original series and next-gen era stories that any first-time viewer will lose a great deal. Some of the story points Enterprise calls back/forward to include Khan and genetic engineering of superhumans from TOS and Star Trek II, the changing appearance of Klingons in TOS versus Next Gen, and even 2 species that aren't officially encountered until a century later, the Borg and the Ferengi. Many references are also made to the Star Trek First Contact movie with the Next Generation cast due to its time travel plot. Because Enterprise makes all of these references, often with little or no explanation, I think it's best for the viewer to be familiar with those stories and creatures ahead of time. Season 1 of Discovery has made some references, but they're more Easter eggs for the hardcore fan, and aren't as dependent on the viewer already being aware in order to follow the story. So, starting with Discovery for your husband is a good way to introduce the show for those who are completely unfamiliar, but now that you want to expand into the other series, I recommend following production order for the most part. My suggestion would be, pick an episode of TOS that you think your husband might enjoy the story. For instance, City on the Edge of Forever if he prefers drama, or Trouble with Tribbles if he wants a more comedic episode to start with. Remind him going in that the effects are from a low-budget 60s show, and bear that in mind when watching. If he enjoys that, then start with TOS from the beginning, with The Cage as a prequel, and go from there into the animated series, as it's about as faithful an adaptation as there could be. Once you're done with those, or if he seems to be turned off by the 60s era production values, move ahead to the TOS movies. Personally, I think you can skip the first movie, aka Star Trek the Motion Picture, and the 5th, Star Trek The Final Frontier, but definitely watch 2, 3, and 4, as they are what I consider to be the epitome of the original cast's stories. Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, is a nice end cap on the TOS characters, and has a brief reference to a next-gen character, but it's in the Easter egg category, so you can watch that before getting into TNG, even though it was released during that show's run. Now, you can start in on the Next Generation. While the special effects are much closer to what we expect from today's television, we're still talking about a 30-year-old show now, and there were a lot of behind-the-scenes issues happening that caused the first 2 seasons to be pretty weak overall, So if you see your husband's interests start to flag, check out some of the skip guides that are out there that move you forward into the more important and higher quality episodes. As I mentioned earlier, TNG and DS9 aired somewhat concurrently and are supposed to take place at approximately the same time, but there's so little crossover and or references to each other that you don't need to go through any special trouble to line things up. Personally, I think the best way to watch is to go through each series completely, then move on to the next one. However, if you want to watch closer to an in-universe timeline, you should watch Season 6 of Next Gen, then Season 1 of DS9, Season 7 of Next Gen, then Season 2 of DS9. Then alternate seasons of DS9 and Voyager, starting with DS9 Season 3. There are also the Next Generation movies. First Contact is almost universally agreed to be the best of these, so be sure to watch that either between DS9 and Voyager, if you're marathoning each show, or between Seasons 5 and 6 of DS9. If you want to get very specific, you should watch First Contact between episodes 14 and 15 of DS9 Season 5, as the movie is briefly referenced in the latter of those two. If you want to squeeze the other movies in, the best thing would be to watch Star Trek Generations right after finishing The Next Generation. Insurrection should go after finishing DS9, and Nemesis takes place after Voyager is finished. Finally, you can go back and enjoy Enterprise, which, although not a ratings giant, is a strong series in its own right, especially in the final 2 seasons. However, be prepared for a disappointing finale. Pretty much everyone involved has said that the framing device used in that episode was a mistake, and I would find it hard to disagree. Now, I did not mention the more recent J.J. Abrams directed/produced movies, Star Trek, Star Trek Into Darkness, and Star Trek Beyond until now. These all take place in an alternate timeline called the Kelvin timeline by fans, as the inciting incident that changes events takes place on the USS Kelvin. Because these are in an alternate universe, they don't fit into the timeline anywhere. If you want to watch them, I would do so after you finish the rest of your viewing project, so as to avoid any confusion between this timeline and the Prime timeline that most of your viewing takes place in. Also, references are made to all of the previous series in one way or another, so you're more likely to get all the little in-jokes and Easter eggs if you wait on these. Now, if you include those 3 Abrams movies, you're looking at around 556 hours of viewing. So you've got your work cut out for you. Keep me updated as to how it's going, especially if you or your husband ends up with any more questions along the way. And to all my listeners, if you have something in the geek realm that you'd like to know more about, or you'd like to, me, about something I've said, please send me an email at welcometogeektown, all spelled out, @gmail.com. You can also leave a comment directly on the show notes at www.welcome2geektown.com. Other contact options include facebook.com/welcometogeektown or Twitter @geektownpodcast. In the meantime, don't forget to subscribe and give me a 5-star review over on iTunes to join the Geektown City Council and help other people find the show, so we can all tell them, welcome to Geektown, population, us. Welcome to Geektown is written, narrated, edited, and produced by me, Kurt Onstead. Theme music is by Aaron Levitz, logo art by Archie Santana. All other sound clips are the copyrighted material of their respective owners, and no infringement is intended, falling under fair use.